I had a studio. I had a glamorous, big, beautiful studio in New York, and it had, this wonderful cement floor and a cement wall, and for the longest time, I was looking at Irving Penn's work and just loved how simple and direct and strong it was, and it became my background. And I did several portraits there. They're very, very graphic. I mean, they don't have too much to do with the people. They just have to do with the the studio and the idea of presentation. It is what I do when I go into the studio. At the very least, I know how to compose. And these pictures are very graphic and very composed. I think I've learned after all these years that I'm an observer. And if I don't have enough to sort of grab onto in a studio, I don't have enough to tell a story for myself personally in the studio. I like a story. I like to be somewhere. I like to see something unfold. If you're in a studio, for me, this is a personal issue. If you're in the studio, you pretty much, that's what you're getting. Not that you're making it up anymore. You're not really making it up, and things still do unfold and things still happen, but they're not as interesting to me. I just like to watch something. I like to be somewhere. I love the light changing. I love observing. I just feel like at a certain point the studio doesn't give me any of that. I never felt comfortable as a studio photographer, but I was enamored and loved Irving Penn's portraits in the studio. So this floor and this wall sort of became my Irving Penn exercise. And in this particular series of photographs, which I now think of coming from having that studio and having that floor and that wall, to me, I look at them now and I see the floor and the wall more than I see the people. But they really are very good examples of very simple composition using the perspective of the horizon line, of where the horizon line hits. So, you see Chuck Close, and that's really, coming down lower to look at the wheelchair from a lower angle. Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, I can see that I'm basically just standing up and just using my own height to shoot back at the people. And I'm sort of definitely seeing where is that horizon line hitting in the photograph. And I'm using that as part of my composition. I'm not even so aware I'm doing that. And Lucinda Childs, who's a dancer, she's like a diagonal cutting across the horizon line in the back, and you see much more floor. So this is just a simple exercise by looking at these. These are four of probably many, many photographs I took in that studio, where the floor and the wall became part of the composition. I think on some level, having worked the studio like this, I became very aware of how I wanted to get out of the studio, because I know one thing about myself is I can always back myself up with composition, and I feel like it's a little bit of a crutch when it comes to portraits, and even though I kind of like the simplicity of the portrait that way, I'm not too sure it says enough about the subject. And I miss the storytelling aspect in my photographs that I love the most, where you can get that on location. And it is a lot harder, but I think in these pictures you can see the simplicity of composition. I know that my photographs, when they're on location, if they're in someone's house and someone's sitting in a chair that they sit in, or, or we're in a place that has something to do with that person, it's going to be a much stronger photograph for me than for me personally in the studio. I sort of use the studio as sort of like passport pictures or something. I mean, I'm not bad at it. I just, if you get someone like LeBron James and you want to do, a sort of a body study, I think the studio is a very handsome place, place to work. I think I've learned that being on location, I mean, I'm looking at the Agnes Martin picture. She still had not agreed to let me take her picture. And I went out to Taos, New Mexico, with the idea that she still hadn't agreed. It's just one of those things. I had lunch with her, and then she said, I could come to her studio. And I went to her studio the next morning, and walked in, and there was like this bed, and there was the canvas, and I said, well, what do you do when you come in here? She said, well, I come over and I sit here and I wait to be inspired. I love that. I just love that. Isn't that what we all do? We wait to be inspired. And so I said, would you just sit there? So she sat there, and it's just like one of my favorite photographs of her just sitting there. It's what we all are waiting to be inspired. She thinks of herself as a writer. She's, of course, so much more than that, to us, to all of us. It was like I asked her how she would like to be photographed, and she said, well, I like to sit on the rocks in Central Park. And so I said, okay, which rock do you like to sit on? And there's a lot of rocks in Central Park. The stories are more complicated than that because, the rocks in Central Park mean a lot to her. She feels like the rocks were there before all mankind. But I found a rock that I thought was kind of nice, and it was a rather large rock over by the pond. So we went out and did some photographs of her, sort of sitting on that rock. And I mean, they were nice. They were nice. And then we went back to her apartment, and she sat down at her desk. And I just looked at her over at her desk, and I just said, this is great. This is, and I just took some photographs of her sitting at her desk. And it's quiet. We're so complicated as human beings. There's so many parts to us. It's really one of the complications of doing a portrait of someone is that I just can't get it in one photograph. I don't know if I believe it. I think you have, this portrait is going to be like a small piece of that person. And it's also my point of view. So when I look at this picture of Gloria, like in the room at her desk, I think, well, that is part of Gloria, but that's not like Gloria, and I'm glad to see that part of Gloria.